This is a production of Cornell University.
I am going to introduce the next speaker. And David Duda, I feel like I can personally attest to the quality of his winemaking because he was kind enough to give me some wine a couple of years ago when I was out in Western New York, and it was delicious. But David Duda is a winemaker and blueberry grower who runs Duda's Blues in Machias, New York. His signature wine is made from blueberries, but he also creates blends from rhubarb, raspberries, and other fruit. 2022 will mark the 10th year anniversary of Duda's Blues, and Dave is joining us today to share how and why he went into winemaking, and he'll offer advice for anyone here considering making the leap into a value-added product. And David, I know you don't have a presentation, but if you are sharing it, you should be. If you're on the presenter view, your picture should pop right in there, and I'll let you take it from here.
All right, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
All
And
right,
we can
great.
see you perfectly.
Thank you, Laura. I'm glad you enjoyed the wine I gave you a couple of years ago. Let me start out by kind of giving you an idea where I came from, what I do here. I was born in Buffalo native. I've lived in New York State all my life. I bought my farm about 30 years ago, and on the farm there was 400 blueberry bushes. So we started picking blueberries and selling them, and kind of wound up where we are today. Before I go too much into the farming part of it, I just want to tell you I'm a retired truck driver. I drove trucks for 33 years, and I was very, very lucky and fortunate. I have 3 million miles of safe driving, was never involved in any accidents or anything. So I guess I was pretty lucky there. I guess how I could start out here is we bought the farm about 30 years ago, like I said, and we had people come over and pick our blueberries. It was while I was still working full time, so I really didn't, when I first started, didn't really know much about marketing or anything. So after maybe 5 or 6 years after owning the farm, we started taking our blueberries up to the markets in Buffalo, New York. And well, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself for a little bit. I want to tell you a little bit what convinced me. That was the question to get into this blueberry farming. It was about, I would have to say maybe 12, 13 years ago. I was making wine, giving it away. I didn't sell it or anything at that point. And I had some wine. I took over to my youngest son, Joe's house one day, and his girlfriend, Shelby, was there. And we opened a bottle of wine and was drinking it. And Shelby says, "Mr. Duda, your wine is so good. You should make this stuff and sell it." And I thought she was just being, nice and just commenting me. But it happened a couple of times I went over, and she kept trying to convince me, "Mr. Duda, you should make this wine and sell it. It's so good." And then other people were telling me the same thing. So I was kind of wondering, yeah, maybe there is some truth to this. Maybe I am making some pretty good wine. So I guess the final straw was I went to Joe's house one day, and again, Shelby says, "You should make this wine." And then my son Joe says, "Dad, Shelby and I are going to get married in the near future here, and we were wondering if you could make the wine for our wedding so we could do our traditional toast instead of using champagne." And I said, "Yeah, sure. I'd love to do that for you guys." So my first question to Joe was, "Joe, do you have to get married?" And he says, "No, Dad, we're going to plan this." I said, "Well, when are you planning on getting married?" He said, "About a year and a half from now." And I said, "That's great." I said, "That's about how much time I need to make this wine." I didn't want to rush it or anything. So anyway, so the wedding day, we're at the wedding reception, and the grooms traditionally get up and thank their new father-in-laws and their fathers for, the wedding and all the procedures that it takes to make a wedding. And he says, and I want to thank my dad for making the blueberry wine. And it's still, I get emotional today thinking about it. So when he said that, he thanked me. Everybody at the reception stood up and applauded me. And I never had anything like that happen in my life. And I think that was the thing that changed my whole attitude about going from hobby into full time. At that point, I had a couple more years of driving to finish up, about 3 more years or so. And then when I retired, we started making the wine. I applied for my license, and it took a little time. We got that, and that's the story how I got interested in it. So we started making the wine after I got the license, and we were taking our wines to the farmer markets, and we sold it there for a few years. And then we were in a market up in Alden, New York, and it's just a summer event. So we were there for the whole summer. And at the end of the summer, we weren't selling there anymore. And it just happened there was a liquor store in that plaza. And about 2 or 3 weeks after the market, my phone rang, and it was the owner of the liquor store. And he says, I'd like to speak to the owner of Duda's Blues. And I said, well, you're speaking to him. He says, he goes, I keep getting people keep coming in here every day asking for your wine. They said they want to know why you're not at the farmer's market and if he could sell it. So he called me a couple of times, and we decided to give him some wine, and he's been a regular customer. He's been one of our retailers that we distribute to now, which are very few at the moment. But our plans are to expand this year, and we're going to probably go be selling to more retailers this year. But so as my business has been expanding here, 4 years ago, we could see the growth really starting to take off. So we cleared some land, some virgin ground here. And when I cleared the land, it was all wooded property. We checked the pH, and it was 4.8, which is perfect for blueberries. I didn't have to amend the soil or anything. It was great. So we put in another 4,000 bushes, and we probably will start harvesting from them this year, and next year should be really good harvest from them. So that's where we're at now. We're expanding our marketing, and we have to take this business to the next level. Business has been so great. For the last 3 years, every year our business has doubled for 3 years in a row. And I can see where we're really, really going to benefit from all the hard work that we've been doing here. Where are we going here? So yeah, we're working on expanding our marketing. And another thing we decided to do this year was not only am I a vintner now, but now I'm a rookie distiller, I guess. I have friends that know about distilling, and I played around with it a little bit. And I just bought a 100-gallon copper still that we're going to put in production here probably in a couple of weeks. We planned on doing it sooner, but just before the holidays, about a month before the holidays, the wine business it was almost out of control. I had no time at all to set my still up and start distilling. So the wine business is phenomenal. So what we're doing now, we're getting into the distilling part of it, and we take our wines that we make, and we're going to run them through our still. It's a copper still, and which is great for brandies. In fact, it's ideal. That's what you want in a copper still, and really brings the flavors up nice and everything. So that's where we're headed, and things are really starting to shape up around here. They're looking really good. We're getting really busy. I got a great family that backs me up. My wife is wonderful. She helps me with shipping. We do ship all across the United States. We started about 2 years ago. And that business is starting to pick up. We're building a website to work on so we can get a little more sales online, especially today with everything going on in the public with the COVID and stuff like that. We think that the website might be a good direction for us to head into right now. So,
Dave, can I ask you a couple questions and maybe read some from the chat box?
absolutely, please do, Anya.
I am wondering how, of all of your production, how much goes to fresh fruit sales and how much goes towards the wine production?
Okay, well, that's a good question. Let's see, about probably 5 years ago, I would say 50-50. And right now, we don't sell anything at markets right now because I just don't have anything more available. The business has been growing so much that we couldn't sell anymore at the farmer markets. We just take our wines to the markets now.
Okay.
But now with the new plantings this year, if things pick up, possibly we'll have some, but I think basically we're really looking at not selling a lot of blueberries for the next few years. Probably we need everything we can get for production.
Okay. And do you harvest everything by hand?
Yes, right now we do.
Wow.
I'm lucky to have a few Amish families around here, and I have about 12 Amish girls that pick for me. Yeah, that we do everything. We pick everything by hand right now. We are planning on expanding a little bit more. We want to put in. Oh, we're looking at probably over the next few years. I'd like to plant another 25 or 30 acres blueberries. So at that point, we'll probably purchase a machine for machine picking because that's quite a bit to harvest by hand.
So we have a few minutes here, and so people can either put their questions right into the chat box, or they could even unmute themselves and ask their question. It might be easiest for us to, unless we get a flurry of questions. Jessica is wondering which varieties work well for you.
Well, when I bought my farm, there was already 5 varieties here. My favorite from all the blueberries that are on my farm, I would say, are my Herberts. You don't find very many of them for sale, but if you can find Herberts, they're a wonderful berry, especially for making wines and brandies and stuff. They're not the very best berry to take to marketing because they don't hold up very well, but the flavor is phenomenal. And when I pick and take them to the winery to process them, they don't really, it's not like what am I trying to say here? The shelf life isn't that great on them, but if you're using them like I am for what I use them for, they're phenomenal for flavors and stuff. Then we have another variety called Covell. It's an older variety, very reliable, high yields, delicious flavors. So I would have to give those 2 berries pretty high marks on my farm.
Great. Ron is wondering if you have any issues with birds.
Yes, I do. We feed the birds every year here. They probably get about 10% of my crops. I don't have bird netting up and stuff like that, but we're looking into one of those, they call them bird cannons or something. It would probably help us a little bit, but yeah, they're not detrimental, but yeah, it certainly is an issue. And if you're thinking about putting in a big patch, you should consider maybe trying to protect them from the birds, because once they find them, they'll be there every day until they're gone.
Yeah, that's for sure. And our guesstimation for bird loss is almost 30% for most places that don't have any kind of bird control strategy. Jim O'Connell is just wondering if you are anticipating that the wine business will keep growing, and that's really what you're planting for, is the wine business, not so much for the fresh fruit market.
Yes, the answer to that would be yes. We're not gearing toward marketing blueberries right now because the business is growing so fast. And now that we're going to be distilling, we're going to need a lot more berries. So we're planning on using every bit of our stuff for value-added products for our farm.
Okay, that's great. Matthew's wondering what your biggest challenge has been with your farm business.
Biggest challenge. I would say, the labor part of it. It seems like it's every time I need to get the work done, I can never make it on schedule. I'm always trying to find people to help me get things, caught up. So, I would say the labor part of it is the biggest issue. And with that said, I'm looking into the future when we do want to expand more, and I'm absolutely looking into a machine to help me pick, because that's probably one of the biggest issues that farmers are faced with today, especially here in up in the Northeast and the farmers in New York. We have a little issue trying to find people to come and work on the farms in the summer. So, and it's the hottest part of the season. I can understand why maybe it's a little bit harder to get to work on days like that, but that's one thing that we're faced with is labor issues. And I would have to say that that's probably the most difficult thing we have to deal with here.
All right. Chuck is wondering if spotted-winged Drosophila affects your product.
Yes, somewhat. Not so much as if I was going to go to market, because when we pick our berries, we don't spray anything. We don't spray. We haven't even sprayed organic sprays, and I think this is going to be the 4th year if we don't spray anything at all this year. What I find is that if you're out there and you pick every day, and you're not taking them to market, that's one advantage I have, is I can take them and put them right in a freezer, get them cooled down in a cooler and put them right in a freezer. So that really does save a lot of headaches for me. And I talk to people all the time about some of my berries. If they have a little blemish on them and I point that out, they don't really care. They're more interested in not having any sprays or anything. That seems to be the most important thing that consumers and wine consumers too, because I talk to people at the markets. They want to know how I process my wines and how I do it, and do I spray and not. And they're really happy to hear that I don't spray. They really kind of like that about my products.
All right, that's great. There's some comments from Gary about hydrogen sulfate. I think that's for maybe the session before this. I'm not sure, but he also,
I don't
yeah.
know. Yeah.
And he also says to try an air dancer for bird control, which has been shown to be pretty effective to try to discourage birds. So that might be, yeah. I have a question about the shelf life of fruit wines. I have been told by some people that fruit wines should be drunk within the year that they are made. Is that true?
I don't know. I can tell you my wines. I've had blueberry wine that's been 5 years old in a bottle, and it's good. Now I can tell you I've had blueberry wine that's been 7 years in a bottle, and it's not that good. My sister called me up one day about 4 or 5 years ago, and she says, "Hey, I found this bottle of blueberry wine you made like 5 years ago." And I go, "Oh, we'll have to drink that sometime." Well, another year or two went by, and it was about 7 years old. I went over, and I have to tell you, it was not as good as it was when it went in the bottle. So I would have to disagree with 1 year, especially with my wines. I know my wines, we don't use any sulfites or anything in our wines, and they still are fantastic after 5 years. But I always tell people when I sell them a bottle of wine, I'll get a question once in a while. Well, how long can I keep this bottle? How long will it be good? And I tell them, look, take that bottle home and drink it as soon as you can, and come back and get a fresh one. And they always come back. So maybe there's something to that.
That's great. Do we have any other comments or questions for Dave? Anybody else want to offer their insight on these kind of value added products?
If you don't have any questions, I would like to make a comment on value added products for farmers. If there's anybody out there that's a farmer or thinking about being a farmer, and you want to grow crops to sell them to the big guys, take 10% of them crops and make something out of them. Make jam or jelly or something. it's all extra income for your farm. And believe me, you need all the extra income you can get. I don't really, I wouldn't recommend just being a farmer to grow blueberries and sell them. Try, do something with them. If I just grew blueberries to sell them, I don't think I would, I think I'd be struggling a little bit. My wine business has really been fantastic for me. And I'm just so grateful for that. It definitely look into making something out of it. Make juice, make soft drinks for children or anything. We're actually looking into stuff like that for our future. So if you're a berry farmer, I urge you to look into, making stuff out of your products, because you'll make a lot more money. You will, and that's what you really need, all the money you can get your hands on to survive in this business. So please look into value-added products, and don't sell 100% of your stuff to somebody that's going to make something out of it. Cut that guy out a little. You don't have to cut him right out altogether, but save a little bit for yourself.
It's great advice. I have a couple more questions here, and because we still have time, we'll go ahead and try to get them answered. What sort of press do you use?
I actually, I don't press my stuff. I actually grind it up. I used to use a meat grinder, and now I've got a thing they call a buffalo chopper. It's not a motorcycle. It's a little machine that grinds up your berries, and it like emulsifies them. It just whips them right up into this like puree, and then I just put that into my barrels, and man, that stuff settles out so beautiful. That's what I do. Everything goes right into the primary fermenter.
That's great. We've got a question from Kevin. Do you test the berries' Brix levels before you harvest?
I do, yeah. And usually they're a little bit lower than I want. I like to start out at about 21 Brix. So sometimes I'll wind up adding a little sugar so I can get my Brix up. So we want to be up there so we have a good alcohol content. So yeah, it definitely is a very good idea to check your Brix, and aim for 21 or even higher when you're making fruit wines.
All right, great. There's a question about how you price your wine.
How I price it?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we figure everything into it, labor costs and all the time that we've got into it. And we don't really compete with the guys that sell their wine cheap. My wine, it's not cheap, but I'll tell you one thing: we put a lot of love into it, and a lot of work goes into it. So I think it's worth every penny that I charge for it. And I never have anybody ever complain about my prices. I will admit I'm a couple dollars more than the guy next to me, but we do have, I'm going to tell you, we probably have the better choice.
That's good. And lastly, I've got a question about how do you control weeds in a planting of your size?
Well, it takes practice, but I do have one of those weed whackers, and I don't get too close to the plants. So I do use the weed whackers to knock down the weeds in between. And I usually have like two guys going at the same time, one on each side of the row. And I watch them very carefully, because you do not want to get too close to the plants. Obviously, you don't want to hurt them. But we do put mulch on there. We have we used to use sawdust, but we're hearing that that's not the best thing anymore. It will change your pH in your soil too, which is beneficial if you're using it to take it where you need it. But wood chips seem to work best. It seems like not too many things like growing in big wood chips. So I would recommend that to anybody that's planning on putting in a blueberry patch.
All right, great. David, thank you so much. I wish we had been able to order tiny little bottles for everyone who attended so they could all have a little virtual taste testing, but next time we'll think of that. Thank you very much for joining us.
Could I have just one more minute?
Sure.
Okay. If anybody's interested, you can order my wines on dudasblues.com. and we do ship anywhere.
Make sure they like our page on Facebook.
Oh yeah, if you could just like our page on Facebook, that would help us out tremendously. We
They
would
can
like
always
that.
shoot me a message for ordering also.
Yeah, you can also, yeah, just send me a message if you want to order, and I'd be glad to talk to you and take your order. And then just one more plug before you go. I would like to ask everybody, and if you haven't already joined the New York State Berry Growers Association, please consider joining us because it's a great organization. And I got to tell you, they've been tremendously helpful for me. Anything I didn't know about blueberries or raspberries or any kind of berry, they're there to help you. And they have all the experts. In fact, the experts are with you here today. All the people from Cornell University work with us, and it's great benefit. You have all the benefits of Cornell if you join New York State Berry Growers Association, because we all work really close together. And then I'd like to thank everybody in my family for helping me to get where I am today. And that's about it. Thank you for the extra time. God bless all the farmers in America, and God bless America.
Thanks, David, very much. It's really, really enjoyable.
Thank you so much.
All right, our next speaker is Kristen Park. Chris is an extension associate and researcher at the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell. Her work focuses on the economics of fresh produce, and she's contributed much to our understanding of the fruit and vegetable market in New York State. Today, she's going to be talking to us about the latest survey of berry pricing in New York State. And Chris, you should be able to share your screen.
So first of all, I really do want to thank the New York State Berry Growers Association for funding this project. It's a project that was started by Marvin Pritz a number of years ago. And then Miguel Gomez in our group in the Dyson School has taken it on. This study in 2020 was actually conducted by one of our graduate students, but she has left and is in graduate school in China. And so I'll be presenting her results. Okay, so, I think it's really important to revisit the question, why are we conducting this berry pricing study? And what happens is we conduct it every couple of years. So actually you'll be getting another survey from us at the end of this growing season in the fall of 2022. But it's important because for one thing, berry farms need information, and they need data, and pricing information and pricing data, at least for New York State berry growers, is not collected and disseminated by any of the government agencies. So this study is very important. And the other idea is that you are using so many market channels and sales channels, and the prices for these many different channels are never collected individually by any of the state or federal price reporting agencies. So this is another area where this study is particularly useful and important. So this is the berry pricing survey that we released in the fall of 2020. It was a very difficult year for everybody at that time. So we want to thank everybody who did participate in 2020. We thank you very much for participating. We sent also, what's very interesting, we sent the survey out in two forms. We sent it out as a paper mail-in survey, and we also sent links to an online survey. And actually, most of our respondents preferred the paper mail-in survey, which I have to admit is a lot easier, I think, for our respondents to complete and send back. But the online survey was available. About 75% of respondents filled out the mail-in survey, and about 25% completed the survey online. So as I mentioned, 2020 was a difficult year for everybody. Our numbers were down a little bit since 2018. You notice that in 2018, our total respondents was 117, and in 2020, we're 99. We hope that those numbers will come up in the future as perhaps things get a little easier for people. I have to say that if we look at the distribution of responses that we received from 2018 to 2020, really the proportion of respondents who are conventional versus organic and by other measures was very, very similar. So we actually feel very comfortable with how our respondents represent at least what we got back in 2018. So 48% of our respondents grew and sold only one type of berry. However, 52% of our respondents sold 2 or more types of berries. As far as acreage, again, as I said, we were very, very happy to see that the percent of respondents that we received in various sizes, the distribution that we saw from 2018 and 2020 was very, very similar. So as we compare prices between 2020 and 2018, we feel much more comfortable knowing that this distribution was very similar between the 2 study years. Now, how did the respondents use various marketing channels? The big number that I saw that drew my attention was that so many more of our respondents are using many more marketing channels in 2020 than they were in an earlier study year of 2009. So 80.3% of our respondents sold through UPIT channels, and 40.6% sold wholesale, and 76.8% sold retail. So if you look at 2009, which is early on in the berry pricing studies, probably not very many respondents were utilizing all of these marketing channels. So when we look at the year 2020, so many of our respondents are using, almost as many marketing channels as they can manage. And so that brings me to another point, is that the more marketing channels that you use and you sell your berries through, really the more management time you have to put into understanding how to price for each one of those channels. So I want to applaud all of these growers who are using and managing so many different marketing channels. I do want to point out that the channel that I call retail here actually encompasses, what I had to do was collapse several different retail outlets and collapse pricing data from farmers markets, farm stores, retail stands, and online orders into one, what I called the retail marketing channel. And this is because data were, if you looked at all of these different individual farmers markets, farm stores, online orders, the data was a little too thin. So I collapsed those into one channel that I called retail. So what were the berry prices like? So this is a table of different types of blueberries for the three major marketing channels: the year 2018, the year 2020, and then the column on the far right, which is the change or the difference between the 2 years. And I very happily, I'm happy to report that the change in 2020, was good. Most of the marketing channels, and as presented here, you-pick and wholesale in particular, were higher in 2020. Oddly enough, as you can see here, the retail channel in 2020 was actually priced lower than in 2018. And it was fairly consistent by every berry variety. So one guess would be that maybe consumers were shunning going inside farm stores. So maybe berry growers reduced the price a little bit on retail. That's just a guess. And perhaps maybe in the chat, if you could mention your own ideas on why we tended to see the retail price drop from 2020 from 2018. The other prices look good. There were gains in prices in you-pick and wholesale, but fairly consistently, the retail prices seem to decline in 2020. These are for blueberries and strawberries. Here is the table for raspberries and blackberries. So again, you can see good prices in 2020, some declines in retail for fall raspberries. The prices on blackberries, we didn't have quite as many farms selling blackberries, so I'm not quite as comfortable in interpreting some of the changes that we see there, because the berry numbers might have been a little scarce for those prices to be fully representative of what was happening in the state. But again, if you have any ideas of your own and want to place them in the chat, I'm sure that we'd all appreciate your insights into these. One thing that I also wanted to mention, other than the good prices in 2020 compared to 2018, was the wide ranges in prices that growers were reporting. So this is a table that has the average price per pound on the left, and it also contains what the minimum price was for that berry type for that market channel and the maximum price. And you can see just for blueberries, you-pick operations, what a large range is being charged across the state. Now, what we want to consider is that these berry operations can be quite varied. For instance, that maximum might possibly include organic producers, whereas the minimum perhaps might be those growers who are producing conventionally. So depending on a farm's cost, will help determine the price that they are selling for. We can see that this is trend repeats itself over berry type and repeats across every marketing channel. So a wide range in prices being charged across the state. So as I mentioned before, some of the price differences might be according to what production method is being used on the farm. There's organic versus conventional. Some growers also might be growing with season extension, protected environment. They might be producing in greenhouses during the off season and able to get a better price during different times of the season. So we have to consider that. Berry varieties, berry varieties, the Dane neutral or the specialty novel berries and varieties could command a price premium. And, possibly some of the farm services that are available, if it's particularly accessible, or the labor assistance that's involved that the farm has to hire. And also, last but not least, is the farm location. Is the farm in a well-to-do neighborhood? Is it in a peri-urban setting where it's close to consumers that are able or interested in, particularly interested in local berries? This will also help provide the ability of a farm to command a higher price. If you're in a rural area, you don't have the luxury of having consumers around who can pay a high price premium, then you have to adjust your pricing expectations. So for 2022, our upcoming season, just some ideas that for you to consider when you're starting to price your berries this year. Make and or follow your pricing strategy. What kind of pricing strategy do you want, and do you want for every market channel that you're selling in? And know your costs. So know what your costs are going into your sales, so that you know and also understand what margin you need on top of your production costs in order to pay for your selling and marketing costs. And don't forget to include profits for yourself. And also evaluate the prices in your area. What are retailers selling berries at? What are other farms selling berries? You might even want to go online and peruse the online Facebooks to see what other farms are going to be charging or are charging. And also consider, this takes a little more management, a little more time management, but you might also want to implement some tier pricing if you think that's appropriate for your farm. For instance, if you want to target certain customers in your UPIC, if you want to target those customers who are picking for volume, maybe you set aside a special day or have an early bird price. There are opportunities, I think, to tier price if you want to. And lastly and not leastly, and I'll repeat this, know what your costs are going in, and don't undercut your prices without knowing what your true costs are, and include profitability with that. So I just want to say again, thank you to the New York State Berry Growers Association. I do want to say again that the next berry pricing survey is actually going to be coming this fall. So please consider filling out the survey when you get it. Look forward to the survey coming out, because the more respondents that we have, the better that the information we will have going back to you. In addition, we will be conducting interviews and surveys about the minimum price increases for labor and for the employer-employee overtime rates, which hopefully will not be changing this year, but we will not know until the board makes a recommendation and the governor passes that recommendation, if it's passed. But we will be conducting those interviews and that survey this winter, soon. And if you get a call from us, please consider being a part of that very important research. So if you're interested in a copy of the 2020 report, it can be found at this URL. I'm sorry, it's very long. But if you would like a copy, you can also just email me, ksp3@cornell.edu, and I can send you a copy of the report. Okay, that's all I have, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's really interesting. And it's, I have to admit, for me, it's kind of confusing sometimes trying to figure out why some of those things are the way they are. There are a couple quick questions. I don't know if you saw these. Wondering about the possibility of asking growers to report prices by container size, pint, half pint, quart, or make something. And there, Lori made a comment about converting, maybe having a quick conversion thing in the description about a pint to and a quart, what that is for poundage. So if you want pounds to be reflected, maybe you could help them somehow convert it or something like that. I don't know. I think that's a really good point.
No, that is a really good point. We do offer a conversion, and on the paper survey, it's very hard on the online survey to handle all of those options, but at least on the paper survey, we have, and actually on the online, we do have a conversion. So 1.5 pounds per quart, 0.75 pounds per pint. Some people were more comfortable writing down their per quart price in the paper survey, but they need to indicate if it's per quart or if it's per pound. So we'll try to do a little better job of clarifying that. We do have the conversion. We do allow people to respond by quart or pint on the paper survey. It's very, very hard to have that ability on the online survey. So we'll think about that hard. And that also brought up another point that I forgot to mention, is that when you're pricing your product, consumers also need to understand how your product is priced compared to maybe retail, because they see retail all the time. At retail, if they're buying strawberries in a clamshell, the clamshell might be 10 ounces, it might be 12 ounces, it might be 16 ounces. So that price varies at retail, according to the size of the clamshell. But you do have the unit price there at retail. What some consumers tend to forget is that when they go to, say, a farm stand and they see the price of a quart, and they see that quart priced higher than the 16-ounce clamshell at retail, they don't realize that your farm price can be very, very competitive on a per pound basis. So if you're selling per quart or per pint and you want to highlight how competitive it is with, say, local retailer prices, then you might want to have special signage that says the per pound price. So that's also just something to consider when you are marketing your berries, either at the farmer's market or your own farm stand.
That's great, Kristen. Thank you so much. There might be a few other questions in that chat box that we didn't get to, and I would love it if you wouldn't mind taking a peek through them and trying to answer, if you wouldn't mind. And I do want to just say one quick thing, that for those of you who are wondering about quick conversion guides, in the berry guidelines, the Cornell Pest Management Guidelines for Berry Crops, which we put out every year, there is a beautiful conversion chart for all different kinds of things in chapter 2. and it converts quarts of fruit into pounds of fruit, and quarts into pints, and pints into quarts, and then it does a whole bunch of other conversions for pesticides. So that might be helpful for you folks. If you don't, if you have a copy of that, look in chapter 2. All right, I'm going to move on. I don't want to get us too late. And thank you so much, Kristen, for that. It was really helpful. Our next speaker is Dr. Heather Grab, is a senior lecturer. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Heather. I apologize. Is a senior lecturer and researcher at the Cornell University School of Integrated Plant Sciences. For years, she's been studying the well-being of pollinators across diverse agricultural systems. And today she'll be talking about how to manage weeds as well as pollinators in a strawberry field. So Heather, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll let you go ahead.
Thanks, Laura and Anya, for inviting me today. I just want to confirm, can you guys hear me okay and see my slides?
Beautiful.
Lovely. Okay, thanks. So the topic I'm going to talk about today is drawn from data that we've been collecting from, there's many familiar names in the meeting today whose farms we've surveyed over the last several years, looking a lot at plant diversity, crop diversity, and in my case, my passion, which is insects. So I have a couple different examples in the images here of some of the farms that we worked at. And in terms of management styles, you can see the diversity of different systems that we were working in, but all within June-bearing strawberries. So matted row systems in Juneberry is still what we're seeing is the most common production style. But one trend that I've noticed is even within June-bearing strawberry production, I'm seeing a lot more of the plastic mulch for weed suppression and to help keep plants and fruits off the soil. So seeing that used not just within the rows, but also seeing a lot of the weed suppression fabric between rows, and even some growers that have been experimenting with using living mulches between the rows. So there's an example here on the left of a grower that was using a living mulch that was then terminated just before flowering began in the spring. So I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about the distribution of weed pressure that we saw across the farms that we surveyed. So in this plot, every farm has 2 points that are connected with a line. And what we saw is that grasses were generally the most problematic weeds on farms, in some cases making up more than 40% of the cover within these randomized meter squared quadrats where we did our sampling. But we were also seeing in many cases some problematic forbs as well showing up in plantings. Many growers did a great job of keeping their weed pressure quite low. And of course, a lot of the farms that were using these intensive weed suppression systems, using black plastic and using weed fabrics, did a good job at keeping weeds low. Although only around 20% of the farms that we surveyed were using this plastic mulch. And we did certainly see examples of growers who were using matted row systems that were still able to keep weed pressure quite low, in this case through pretty intensive hand weeding practices with big crews that were going out and suppressing weeds, or through pretty regular use of herbicides or pre-emergent herbicides. We also noticed, although we tried to standardize the age of fields that we were sampling within, that some of those fields that had been in production for several years, of course, were more weedy than those that had been more recently established. As part of our broader surveying efforts on farms, looking at weed pressure was just one small component. We also looked at fruit production, and part of that survey work was using these sentinel potted plants that we put out on farms. So unsurprisingly, farms that had really high weed pressure had lower overall production. But by using these sentinel potted plants, we remove that competition factor that weeds have. And we also, in some cases, were able to minimize some of the issues of microclimate that's created when there's heavy weed pressure in a field, so that we could see what some of the effects of those in-field weeds are, mediated through other routes of action. So in that case, by influencing pest pressure dynamics within the crop, or by influencing natural enemies or even beneficial insects like pollinators that may also influence yield in the crop. And curiously, what we found is actually that some of our farms that had the highest weed pressure had lower damage in their fruit and higher average fruit weight. So higher quality berries produced at these sites that had higher levels of weed pressure. Again, that's just in the sentinel plants where we removed the competition effects. So clearly there would be strong effects on fruit production in the field themselves. But when we look at some of the most common weeds that we found, so again, grasses, which are really hard to distinguish among species. We saw, of course, crab grasses and also some nut sedges that were problematic in some areas. But many of the other weeds that are forbs were some plants that provide floral resources potentially for beneficial insects. So things like purple dead nettle or yellow rocket, fleabane, especially in field margins, was a common one. And we know that there are many insects that are very important for strawberry production systems that can be found in close association with many of these different weedy species. So one example here that you're seeing across almost every weedy plant species is that brown plant bug, the tarnished plant bug here. But also some beneficials are associated with many of these as well. So many different native wild pollinator species that could be promoting yield and pollination on farms. Some previous work that we did across farms in the region in 2012 found that tarnished plant bugs are causing as much as 40% damage to berries across the farms that we surveyed. But fortunately, there is a complex of natural enemies in a genus of wasps that include some species that are both native as well as some that were introduced by the USDA that do provide fairly good control of tarnished plant bug populations, particularly when there are floral resources around and natural habitats that can support that natural enemy population. When we're looking at fruits, many people are able to distinguish between when a malformation on a fruit or a cat facing is likely to have been caused by the feeding damage of plant bugs versus by poor pollination damage. But I will say these frequently can look very similar. I have seen and tried to score for damage hundreds of thousands of strawberry fruits. And I, in this case, know confidently because these were experimentally exposed to either poor pollination or to an herbivore. But there's also very many cases, especially in particular cultivars, or when tarnished plant bug feeding happens early, that it's very challenging to distinguish. So the overall sort of guidelines are that when you have large, well-developed seeds that are all clustered together, that's very likely to be symptomatic of tarnished plant bug feeding. Whereas a similar kind of damage, but having very small seeds, is more likely to be poor pollination damage, but it's really hard to distinguish. So if you see these kinds of damage on your fruit, it's good to think about what the insects are that you were seeing in the field during flowering and just after flowering. We also know that pollination is pretty important for strawberry, not equally important across all cultivars, but this is data that we took from Jewel, which at the time of our survey was the most common cultivar grown across farms and likely is still quite common within the region. We did a couple pollination treatments on all of the fruit across the farms that we surveyed, doing bagging so that flowers were only able to self-pollinate by wind or by their own pollen, some open pollination where flowers were exposed just to the pollinators that were available at that farm, and then supplemental hand pollination so we can see what the maximum size of fruit would be if pollen was not limited at the site. And we do see about a 45% increase in yields comparing the self to hand pollination. But we also see that the open pollination is not as high as hand pollination is, which indicates to us that while the insects that are on a farm are providing some good pollination services, it's not always enough to meet the needs of the plantings across farms. And so if we break this down, so this is every farm that we surveyed where their data is an individual bar, and we're just simply subtracting the weight of the fruits that were produced by the supplemental hand pollination to the weight of fruits that was produced just through the action of pollinators on their farm. We see that between 30 and 40% of farms have this pollen limitation where there is pollination need that's not being met. And that's generally explained by the number of insects that we saw, particularly wild bees, that were on the flowers during the bloom period. So if we look at the hand pollinated fruits, doesn't really matter how many bees we saw on a farm in our standardized timed visitation surveys. But what we saw for the open pollinated is that if farms had a lot of bees that were visiting their flowers, we didn't see much difference at all between the open pollinated and our hand pollinated treatment. But we saw the biggest difference at farms that had very few visitors during our timed transect surveys during the early bloom period. The community of bees that's visiting strawberry in New York is not only incredibly beautiful, but also really diverse and interestingly not dominated by the European honeybee. So on average across all of our sites, we have only about 7% of visits coming from European honeybees. I think this is a characteristic of the diversity that we have across all of our farming systems within the region. But I've also heard data from colleagues across the Northeast that they see a similar pattern in other fruit crops as well. So one question I get a lot is, among all this diversity of bees, who seems to be doing the best job? And there was a recent study that I think is really intriguing from our neighbors to the north in Canada that showed that on a per visit basis, wild bees are more effective than honeybees are. And it actually takes about 3 visits by a honeybee in order for them to start to become equal in the pollination services that they are providing from wild bees. And when we have a mixed community, as would sort of naturally occur when you're not excluding visits from one type or another, one really intriguing result that they found is that even when there were multiple different bee species visiting a strawberry flower, it mattered who visited first. And in an interesting way, where flowers that were visited first by a honeybee still had lower yields independent of the number of total visits compared to flowers that were visited first by a wild bee. It's not clear why exactly that is, but kind of an interesting pattern that overall suggests that wild bees are a really important part of the pollination services that are provided to strawberry. And unfortunately, one of the trends that we have seen is that sites that have more agricultural cover in the area surrounding a farm tend to have the fewest number of wild bee visits on the farm. So what can growers do if they find themselves in this spectrum of more simplified landscape compared to those that have a higher cover of natural habitats like woodlots or old fields surrounding their farm? One option we looked at more recently was using these managed bumblebee quads. So we know honeybees maybe aren't the most effective. How about this other managed pollinator like bumblebees that you can bring and supplement onto the farm? We did a large survey in both 2018 and 2019 looking at the effectiveness of bumblebees. And we found that although we still do see evidence that there's pollen limitation, we do not see any difference in the magnitude of change between our open pollination and our hand pollination treatment at sites that did not get a bumblebee quad versus ones that did get bumblebee quads applied to them. So the bumblebees were not very effective at meeting that pollination need that would have normally been filled by wild bees. And probably a big reason for that is that we really didn't see very many bumblebees visiting the strawberry. When we looked at the pollen that those bumblebee colonies brought back into their hive, we actually found on average only about 4% of the pollen that they were returning with was rosaceous pollen. So that's the group that includes strawberry. And about 95% of that was other pollens that were predominantly weeds. So they were doing a good job of visiting weeds, but not so much at visiting the strawberry plantings themselves. So if managed bees are not a great solution, we've also explored other options that growers can use, like planting some nice floral habitats on their farm. And those can provide nesting resources, of course, pollen and nectar, refuge from pesticide applications, or in the case of natural enemies that might be attacking pests, it gives them some alternative resources to use at periods when pest populations might be low within the crop. And so we established 2 plots on 12 different farms across the region. One of the plots was just a control planting, and another one, you can see a little bit from the satellite image, this dark green patch here, that's a native perennial wildflower planting that we put in right next to our experimental strawberry plantings. That's what one of those plantings looks like when it's sort of in its full glory. And what we found when we looked at bee visitation, comparing within each farm, the difference in bees, or in some cases, we also looked at pests and yield, comparing this plot that had a wildflower planting to the one that did not, is this interesting hump-shaped curve. So here above the line means that the wildflower planting had more bees, and actually below the dotted line means that it had less bees. So we see this kind of Goldilocks zone with moderate amounts of natural habitat in the surrounding landscape, predicting farms that will do the best in terms of increasing pollination services when they add a wildflower strip. So some benefit, but only at this sort of sweet spot of farms. And very likely that's because in farms with very little natural habitat, there's just not a sufficient pollinator population and to recruit to that relatively small wildflower planting. And at farms where there's a lot of natural habitat, adding a small wildflower planting is a drop in the bucket. They already had sufficient pollination services to begin with. We saw that even at those farms where there was a positive effect, it took about 3 years for us to start to see that effect. So definitely a long-term investment and something to think about in terms of how you're rotating your plantings if you're establishing one of these wildflower habitats that's going to take 3 years before you start to see an effect. In terms of pests, we actually do see evidence that there can be a spillover of pests. So there was sort of a Goldilocks zone again here in the middle, but no area where there was truly a substantial benefit of adding a wildflower planting in terms of a reduction in pest pressure. And in some of these areas here, we actually saw substantial increases in pest pressure at those sites. Some of that has to do with the fact that our key pests, like the tarnished plant bug, really like many of the plants that showed up. So many of the plants here with asterisks are ones that we planted, but some of them, for example, like Erigeron, that daisy fleabane that we saw earlier, those volunteered within our wildflower plantings, and they supported a lot of tarnished plant bug, but not a whole lot of bees were using those compared to some of the other species that we intentionally planted into our plantings. It also was a little variable depending on what our herbivore taxa was. So tarnished plant bugs, which were the main thing causing damage in terms of insects to our crop, we did see a little bit of an increase in tarnished plant bugs at sites that had a wildflower strip compared to controls. But other pests like strawberry sap beetle and other herbivores like aphids or spittlebugs tended to be a little bit lower. And that's work that one of the undergraduates who worked with us through the Summer Scholars Program, Ellie McCabe, who's pictured here, spearheaded that project. So overall takeaways from today are that we are seeing substantial variation in weed pressure across farms using some of those physical barriers like plastic mulches or weed fabrics can be effective, although there's certainly costs and things to think about in terms of how you manage those across their life cycle. Grasses tend to be one of the most impactful weeds within the system, but there are other flowering plants that may be providing some beneficial services in terms of supporting pollinators or natural enemies. Overall, in terms of pollination, those wild bees are really important for providing pollination services on farms, and honeybees, and even managed bumblebee colonies, which are quite expensive to purchase, are probably not going to be very effective pollinators. And if anything, they're just out there pollinating your flowering weed populations. And in terms of pest management, wildflower plantings can, if not very carefully managed, result in spillover of pests. So it's really important to make sure that the seed mixes that you're getting, or even the volunteer plants like fleabane, are not coming up and providing these really nice alternative hosts for potential pests within the system. So I'm incredibly grateful to all of the growers, some of which are pictured here, many of whom I think are on the call today, who allowed me over many years to come and collect some of this data on your farms. I also have to thank all of the labs that I've collaborated with over the years that have contributed to the project, and our funders as well. And if there's time, I think we're near the end, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Laura, we can't hear you. No, I'm not sure what's gone wrong.
Hi, Laura, I'm not sure what's going on, but I can take over. We do have some time for questions. Session 4 is going to start at 3:45 p.m. So thank you so much, Heather, for this talk. This was super interesting. And Jim is asking, how might you convince growers to stop using bumblebee quads for pollination? Because many, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I would say, of course, if you see on your own farm, if you're purchasing these and they are working for you, that's great. One piece of data that I think was really, really impactful for me, which I didn't share earlier, is this one. So we worked in not just strawberry for this study, but we also surveyed in raspberry and tomato. And we saw very few bumblebees. So there was no bumblebees in our control plots, very few bumblebees visiting strawberry across all the farms we surveyed that had these quads. And importantly, in later flowering crops, especially for tomato, we actually saw that there were fewer bumblebees at sites where we had put a quad compared to sites that don't. And the main reason for that, just some work spearheaded by another student I worked with, Olivia Miller, is that these quads are killing large numbers of wild bumblebee queens that enter through these hive entrances when they do not have queen excluders on them. I have a little video of that. You can see there's queens that are wild. That's a wild queen trying to get into one of these quads. If you do not have an excluder, so there's an excluder on there that keeps her from getting in, you can easily kill 20 or 30 wild bumblebee queens. And that's a colony then that no longer establishes and produces workers that pollinate all of your other crops for the rest of the season. So that's one piece of data that really convinced me why it's probably not a good idea to invest in these, even if they were increasing your pollination in strawberry.
Oh, that just breaks my heart. Thank you so much for sharing that video. I do need to remind everyone that if you want DEC credits, you need to fill out the survey that's in the chat one more time. We will not be offering DEC credits in the 4th session, so this is your last chance. Here's a good question. Chuck is asking, they see a lot of bumblebees pollinating in blueberries. What do you think about that?
So blueberries could actually be a crop system where putting quads in may be effective. I definitely seen a lot of bumblebees as well pollinating blueberries. They're very effective blueberry pollinators because bumblebees do that buzz pollination activity. So most of the pollination needs for blueberry, as long as there's sufficient natural habitat around, can be met by the wild bee populations. There's some great work out of University of Vermont that's showing that supplementing with bumblebees only very rarely gives a positive impact, although more so than it does for strawberry. But I would still be quite worried about these long-term population impacts of putting these quads out, particularly when they do not have a excluder on them, which is not currently how companies, you have to ask specially to get those excluders.
Another question that I have for you is, one time I was at a talk and this entomologist researcher says that on farms that spray pesticides and insecticides, and they have these field borders of wildflowers, they actually found the highest concentrations of pesticides in those borders, which of course it's a little bit counterintuitive. So I'm wondering, where do you think would be a good place to encourage natural vegetation in a farm system?
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky question. I also get that a lot from folks who are doing a lot of under canopy management. So blueberry growers and also orchard folks who want to figure out, like, if I'm spraying, should I mow down all of the dandelions and clovers that are in my field? And I think that is a good practice to do if you're spraying anything that has high toxicity for beneficial insects, because they can always forage elsewhere to find some of those pollen and nectar resources they need. But if they forage on something toxic and they die, then you're out of luck in terms of your pollinators. Not having your planting right immediately at the edge, but with some buffer, is probably a good idea. So often in our plantings, they would be a couple meters away from our experimental planting. Maybe there's a laneway that's going in between the field, which is also really helpful for getting cultivation or harvesting equipment in and out of the field as well.
Thank you. And I see a couple folks in the chat are saying that they see wild bumblebees on their farm, which makes me happy. And C Square is confirming that wild bees are better than bumblebees. Is that correct?
So in the case of strawberry pollination, that is correct. We don't see, so there are queen bumblebees that are flying around during strawberry bloom. I occasionally see a wild queen, so you can tell they're wild because they're really big, whereas the workers in the colonies that you buy are much smaller compared to the wild queens that are out. They don't tend to visit strawberry. It's mostly this other suite of really diverse and much smaller pollinators that are visiting strawberry and providing services.
So would these be like those tiny, shiny green ones?
Exactly, yeah. So some of the pictures I showed earlier show you just the absolutely gorgeous diversity of different bees. that we've been seeing in our surveys. So shiny metallic green, midnight blue, red with stripes. They're very beautiful.
That's incredible. Oh, great. A question from Brian Young. He says that, oh, it's a comment. We stopped using quads 5 or so years ago, and we see many more wild bees, carpenter bees, small bees. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and we've actually, one thing that was wild to see in those bumblebee colonies, the reason why wild queens are going in there is because it's part of their natural behavior to try to usurp or to steal the colonies of other wild queens that have already established. They basically get all the benefits of having a nest without having to do all the work of starting that nest. And we see other bees as well who are also trying to get in. So other bumblebee species, including species that we're really worried about in terms of their population declines over time. But I've also seen carpenter bees in those nests. I've seen tons of honeybees that are going in there and trying to probably steal nectar or other resources from the nest. We see all kinds of wild things showing up in these managed bumblebee colonies.
It's fascinating.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.